Hello, this is an interactive lesson on narrative punctuation for Year 9, and we're going to go over everything that you really need to know in preparation for your upcoming assessment where you have to write a formal narrative. So let's take our way through. But the first thing you need to know about narrative is that it's a constantly changing style, and there's new rules and conventions always being created. The most important thing that you need to really consider is that whatever choices you make about how you lay out your narrative and the punctuation you use needs to be consistent throughout the whole thing. Okay? If you start creating inconsistencies, that's when you're going to find yourself in stride. So we're going to talk through some basic rules associated with punctuation, and hopefully these will give you a bit of a hand. Now, just as a heads up, there's a test at the end of this, and you're going to be required to click through some multiple choice answers, and I'm going to be able to see how you went, and that's going to then give me a bit of an insight about how well you're going and whether you need some extra support. So it's important that you actually pay attention and really show that you understand what's going on. So we'll start with dialogue. Now, a word that we use to describe speaking within the text is dialogue. So whenever our characters are speaking, we call this dialogue. And it's traditionally demonstrated by these two signs kind of over here called quotation marks. So it's not uncommon that you'll see someone using these to show dialogue. And there's an example down here that you can see of someone saying hello. Really simple. You can see the quotation marks being used there. And what it does is it separates this information here from this information with John, which is essentially objective discussion here, whereas in this case this is dialogue. So that's how we know how to see it. In modern fiction, we often see the use of a single apostrophe rather than the double quotations. So that's maybe something that you would see as difference between what you were taught in primary school and what you might read in books these days. It's quite rare that you'll find a book that uses double quotations. It's usually just the singles. There's no rule about which one should be used. However, like I said before, whatever decision you make needs to be consistent throughout the text. So if you're going to use doubles, you have to use doubles right through. If you're going to use singles, you use singles right through. You can't mix and match. So you've just got to really be careful about that. Some texts these days don't use quotation marks at all, and there's a couple out there that you see that are really different in the way that they're laid out. And that just goes to show how narrative texts are always changing. If you look at this example here, and you can read this one yourself, but you'll notice this section here is actually dialogue, but it hasn't been punctuated whatsoever. In some cases, I've read some books where you'll actually see a little dash here as well, but it just goes to show how the rules are always changing. So just be really aware of that. So in this case, when we look at dialogue, whenever we use quotation marks, we have to have punctuation to separate the spoken text from the other text. So you'll notice here in red, I've highlighted all of these different parts where between the end of the word and the quotation marks, there's always some punctuation within this space, and you never leave that blank. So that's a really important rule. If you look down here, this is a simple little sentence, just like I had in the previous slide, but it's grammatically incorrect because there's nothing here. Okay, there should either be a comma or a full stop or a question mark or something in there, depending on what's happening. In this case, it would be a comma, but it needs to break up that speech. So that's a really important thing that students often miss. Indentation is also really important. Whenever you look in your book, what you find is that when someone starts speaking, or even when a paragraph starts, there's this space here, and you can usually achieve this by pressing the tab button if you're on Microsoft Word, but we indent. And this is really just a bit of a common courtesy thing, because it really shows clearly when a new line or a new speaker or a new paragraph is beginning. Whereas otherwise it could be that someone was speaking over here and it was the same person speaking, but they just happened to begin at the top of the line. So it just really takes away that misunderstanding and makes things a lot clearer. So getting in the habit of indenting work is really important. We'll move over to this other rule, which is about starting a new indentation whenever a new character speaks. So you can see in this particular case, and there's a little gap here, which is more of a PowerPoint thing that probably shouldn't be there, so just ignore that. But you can see the first character says, "What are you doing here?" So that's Claire is speaking in this case. She shifted nervously around, and here's all about Claire. But the moment the next person speaks, there's a new line and a new indentation as well. Okay, so that's just a really important habit to get into. The reason that we indent, you'll actually see later on, is to make the reading of information easier. Okay, so it actually really helps us in regard to that. A dialogue tag is where we identify who is speaking, and that usually follows the quotation marks. In this case, this section here, asked Claire or said Terence, these are what we call dialogue tags. Now, when we start to get a bit more advanced in your writing, you find that you don't always need to use such an obvious dialogue tag. You can actually jump straight into the content description. But for now, it's just important to know that that's an important part of the dialogue sequence, making sure that you're being clear in the way that you communicate means using a clear dialogue tag to say who's speaking. Now, it gets more interesting because when there's two people speaking, when we've got here Claire and Terence, when they're going back and forth, a bit like a game of table tennis, we don't have to use a dialogue tag at the end of their speech every time. We actually assume that it's the same two people speaking. So for example, in this case, you shouldn't be here, Claire grunted, so there's a dialogue there to say that this is Claire who's speaking. It's not like you own the car, Terence replied, so now we know that it's Terence speaking. Now, after this, there's a new indentation and there's a new line. So someone else must be speaking. And if it's not Terence, who's the only other person here, it must be Claire. So in this case, we assume that this is Claire that's speaking, even though there's no dialogue tag. And this means that the reader is able to read the information much more clearly without having to constantly read he said, she said, he said, she said. Okay, that's not usually when it comes to good writing, it's about efficiency. So that's a really good tip, and it's a great way if you're writing an argument to have your text really flow and bounce from one from the other. And of course, the same thing happens here. We've got another new line and another indentation, so we would assume that this is Terence speaking. The only way to break that rule is if there was a third person, then all of a sudden we'd have to add another dialogue tag. So all of a sudden, I spoke like Mr. Brown spoke, and you can see I don't draw very well with my mouse. I would have to add on an extra tag there, and in this case you would now know that there's a third person who's speaking. Okay. Interesting rules. If we move on, another common thing we see in modern texts is about using italics. So italics is when you're writing that is slightly slanty. And we see that in a lot of modern texts in particular, and it generally represents someone thinking, so someone's thought pattern. So if someone didn't say something out loud but they thought it to themselves, it's often put these days in italics. Okay, so that's just another way that we can communicate information through different conventions. Paragraphs are also really important. So now we've moved on from our dialogue punctuation, but this is another key thing that you'll be assessed on. Paragraphs work a little bit differently in a narrative to that of an essay. They're generally used for two key reasons. You'll usually see a paragraph if there's a significant change in time or there's a significant change in place, or in some cases both, but we'll try and separate them for the purpose of this lesson. So let's look at a couple of examples. Here you can see I've just identified the paragraph break just to make life a little bit easier. But it says her head fell heavily on her pillow, and before she knew it, she drifted into a deep sleep. Paragraph break when she woke the next morning. So in this case, there's a paragraph break here to represent that a significant amount of time has passed from when she fell asleep, we assumed the night before, to waking up the next morning. Okay, so for that reason, we've used a paragraph break. That's a sensible use of the paragraph break. Like I mentioned, it's not always about time. In this case, you can read, they were closer than they've ever been to knowing the secret location of the treasure. We'd better set off then, George called from the bow of the ship. Just try and stop me, John replied. He hoisted himself up the rigging, looking out onto the horizon ahead. Now, all of a sudden, there's a paragraph break here, and it starts by saying when they arrived at the island. Now, we don't necessarily know how much time has passed here, but we could argue that there's been a bit of time passed as well. But for this example, we're focusing specifically on the fact that they were close to the island before, presumably out at sea on their boat, the bow of the ship. But here they've arrived at the island, so we assume they're on the island. So there's been a significant change in location, and therefore the use of a paragraph is justified. Okay, so it's really important just to be aware of that. Alright, so hopefully you were able to finish those questions correctly. I'll be checking your answers to see how you're going, but just to again put everything in context, I've just put here this is the learning outcome that you're going to be assessed on for this particular narrative. This makes up 1/3 of the score that you're going to get. So you can see to get an A, you need to show dialogue punctuation demonstrating innovative layout. Paragraphs need to be used appropriately to show changes in time or location and complement the storytelling. So in this case, basically what I'm looking for is for you to accurately and consistently demonstrate everything we've just talked about in this video. I hope that this has been helpful to you and that you can use this to really get the best result when it comes to your narrative. Good luck.